This is the 9th video in our series, looking at how you set up and configure a Synology NAS running DStation Manager 7. In our previous video, we assigned our NAS with a static IP address, which means that we're now ready to begin to configure our NAS so that it can act as a network share. By default, our NAS is pre-configured to use something called SMB, which is a file sharing protocol that is compatible with all major operating systems. However, as our NAS can run other file sharing protocols in parallel with SMB, for this video we're going to review the options in File Services. In order to access File Services, we first need to log into DStation Manager using our administrator's credentials. Now from within the desktop of our DSM, if we locate and select Control Panel. When Control Panel loads, we need to find the heading File Sharing and select File Services. Within File Services, we are presented with a panel that displays a number of different network file sharing protocols: SMB, AFP, NFS, FTP, rsync, and Advanced. Each of these protocols relates to a different method that we can use in order to share files on our NAS. So let's take a look at the options available in each protocol. By default, within File Services, only Server Message Block or SMB will be enabled. This is because SMB works with Windows, macOS, and Linux. So due to its versatility, there should be no need to use any other file sharing protocols. A workgroup is Microsoft's attempt to create a simple way to allow Windows computers to share files or network resources. So if you are a Windows user and have already created a workgroup within your home network, by changing the name in the workgroup field, you can add your NAS to your workgroup. However, as we will not be using workgroups, we will be leaving this setting on its default. Disallow access to previous versions will prevent Windows users from accessing snapshots that will allow them to view previous versions of files or folders. However, it's worth noting that this feature will only work if your NAS is using BTRFS. Hide shared folders from users without permission is a useful way to prevent your users from seeing network shares that they don't have access to. While this feature will help to avoid confusion as to where you can save files to, we recommend that you do not enable this setting until after you fully set up your network shares. Enable Transfer Log will log specific user interactions with the files and folders in your network shares. You would enable this option if you need to monitor what users are doing to files on your NAS, or to help troubleshoot problems when accessing or saving files. By default, our NAS is currently only logging deleted or renamed files, so by selecting Log Settings, we can configure the log to monitor other file operation events. When it comes to viewing the logs, we're informed that we should install the full version of Log Center, as it includes additional features not available in the version we currently have installed. Next, we have SMB Advanced Settings. As you can see, there are a lot of SMB variables that can be changed. But for now, because we're in the process of setting up our file sharing services, we're going to leave most of these settings on their defaults. This will then give us a baseline within which we can work. So once we have our file sharing service up and running, if we need to, we can return to the advanced settings and tweak some of the options to try and improve the performance, reliability, and security of our SMB file shares. Let's try and explain what these settings do. WINS stands for Windows Internet Name Service, and is something that will map a computer's NetBIOS name to an IP address. So we use the WinServer field to allow us to add a WinServer address to our NAS, so that our NAS is easier to find when we browse our network. However, as most home networks do not have a WinServer, and Wins is now considered to be a legacy service, rather than using Wins, we should be using DNS instead. SMB has been around for a very long time, and in that time there has been numerous revisions. However, as not all devices will be compatible with the latest versions of SMB, you might find that in order to get SMB to work with older computers, you need to use older versions of the SMB protocol. So while we recommend that you start by using the default settings that you can see in both the SMB Max and Min protocol fields, if you experience connection issues when trying to connect to network shares, you may need to adjust these settings. However, please note that older versions of SMB are no longer considered to be secure. So for example, if you have a computer that will only work with SMB1, you should upgrade the operating system to that computer rather than downgrade the version of SMB being used by your NAS. SMB range simply shows us which SMB protocols we currently have enabled on our NAS. Transport encryption mode allows us to choose the encryption used by SMB3 when transferring files. By default, this option is set to client-defined, which means that a computer connected to our NAS will have to decide if it's going to use this feature. Enable server signing is another security feature that adds a digital signature to packets of SMB data as they move across a network. While you might think that it is a good idea to enable this setting, as it could cause connection issues, for now we will be leaving this setting set to disabled. Enable opportunistic locking, or lock an open file so that no one else can open or overwrite that file while it's being viewed. SMB durable handles seems to be related to allowing users to restore temporarily lost SMB2 connections to our NAS. Basically, when a file is opened via SMB, that file is given a temporary file name. So if SMB durable handles is enabled and you have a short network outage, the connection to the temporary file name and the computer that opened that file are automatically restored. A cache is used to make frequently accessed files load faster. However, sometimes these cached files can become corrupted or go out of date. So Clear SMB Cache is simply a troubleshooting tool that will clear cached files. As macOS now supports SMB by default, we have a macOS tab for specific settings relating to Apple Macintosh computers. So if we select macOS, you can see that we have a setting that allows us to enable VFS module to convert Mac special characters. As macOS is able to use special characters in its file names, for example a backslash or question mark, by enabling this option, we should improve file compatibility between macOS, Windows, and our NAS. AFP or Apple File Protocol is a legacy file service for macOS. So the aim of cross-protocol locking with AFP is to ensure that when a file is being accessed by macOS using AFP, other computers will know that that file is locked while it's being used. However, as macOS now uses SMB as its default file sharing protocol, unless you have specifically configured your Apple Macintosh computer to use AFP, there's no need to enable this setting. Let's select the Others tab. As enabling local master browser is disabled by default, you might find that you can't browse to your Synology NAS from within Windows File Explorer. While we have had no issues leaving this setting disabled, if you are having problems, you might want to check that you have WS Discovery enabled first. Enable Dir Sort VFS module will alphabetically sort directories before they're displayed on a computer. Veto files will allow us to hide files with specific names. For example, files named README or files that use certain extensions like .txt or .config. A symbolic link is a file whose main purpose is to point at another file or folder. So allow symbolic links within shared folders is by default enabled, but allow symbolic links across shared folders is disabled. We suspect that allow symbolic links across shared folders is disabled because this type of link can be used to inadvertently or maliciously expose a network to something called a symbolic link attack. As a symbolic link attack can be used to change file permissions, corrupt or delete data, or cause a denial of service attack, we will leave allow symbolic links across shared folders disabled. Disable multiple connections from the same IP address is an option that will allow only one SMB connection from an IP address. Collect debug logs is an option that allows us to store more detailed logs regarding SMB. However, as this option will affect the performance of your NAS, you would only enable this option if you have a very specific problem. Apply default Unix permissions will set your network shares to use default Unix permissions when either uploading or creating files or folders. However, by default, you will find that this option is disabled. Do not reserve disk space when creating files is an option that we suspect you would enable if you start to run out of storage space on your NAS. However, as this is disabled by default, we recommend that you leave this option disabled. Enable NT-LMv1 authentication is a very old suite of Windows security protocols that are used to authenticate users connecting to a network share. However, as these protocols are really old and insecure, we recommend that you don't use them. Asynchronous read is a way to improve file reading performance on 10 gigabit networks or when reading 4K blocks of random data. However, as we will predominantly be using Wi-Fi on our home network, our Wi-Fi will be creating a data bottleneck that will prevent our NAS from being able to transfer data at 10 gigabit speeds. Then, because by enabling asynchronous read, we will also make the CPU in our NAS work harder, for now we will leave this setting disabled. Monitoring changes to subfolders in a directory is an option that is enabled by default. This setting basically ensures that any changes to subfolders within a directory are tracked so that any computer using SMB will know and can see whenever a folder or subfolder is being modified. Unfortunately, there's very little information about what the setting synchronize data to drive immediately upon SMB client request actually does. However, we think that it is a setting that is related specifically to Synology Drive, which is a service that allows you to create your own private cloud. So this setting seems to be a way to ensure that Drive stays synced with files in our SMB shares. Finally, we have Enable Wildcard Search Cache. A wildcard search is simply a way to conduct a non-specific search by using certain non-letter characters, for example a question mark or asterisk. So for example, if we were looking for any documents that were suffixed by ing, we would conduct a search using an asterisk followed by the letters ing. The results from this search would then display any documents that included words that ended with ing. A cache is simply a location on our NAS used to improve the performance of recently or frequently accessed pieces of small temporary data. So if we often perform large numbers of wildcard searches, we would enable this option. As we have not made any changes to any settings, let's select Cancel. Next, we have a number of notes, which includes how we enable something called a recycle bin. Basically, a recycle bin is a feature that, if enabled, will allow us to easily recover files deleted from a network share. So as recycle bins can be very useful, we will be looking at them in more depth when we create our network shares. You can also see that we have a note informing us that when our NAS indexes its network shares, that index can be used by Windows and macOS to find content on our NAS. The final note simply tells us how we access our SMB shares from Windows and macOS. However, we will be looking at mounting network shares in more depth in a future video. Aggregation Portal is a feature within Windows designed to make accessing network shares easier. However, as Synology recommend that in order to get Aggregation Portal to work, we use something called Directory Service, and Directory Service is usually a tool used by corporate networking, we will not be enabling this setting. WS Discovery is an important service as it allows Windows computers to browse our home network and find any network shares that we've created. While our file sharing will still be accessible with WS Discovery disabled, we're going to leave this setting enabled as Windows users tend to prefer to browse for network shares by using File Explorer. AFP or Apple File Protocol is a proprietary network protocol created by Apple for its macOS computers. However, as AFP is in the process of being deprecated by Apple, and the latest versions of macOS will by default be using SMB over AFP, there's little point in using AFP unless you are using a legacy computer or you're experiencing show-stopping issues using SMB. NFS or Network File System is a protocol developed by Sun Microsystems for its Unix-based operating system. However, like AFP, NFS is also not widely used, so we will leave this setting disabled. FTP or File Transfer Protocol is a protocol that allows us to use the internet to upload and download files to a server. However, with the introduction of cloud storage, as a platform, FTP has become less popular. rsync is a utility that can be used to quickly copy and synchronize files and folders across a network or over the internet. As you can see from the description, by enabling rsync on our Synology NAS, we can make it a backup destination for another Synology NAS or an rsync compatible server. Under the Advanced tab, we have 6 different options. File Fast Clone is a feature of BTRFS that when a file is copied, that file is not duplicated onto our NAS, but instead is given a reference to an existing file until it is modified. So the main benefit in enabling File Fast Clone seems to be to save space on our NAS. Bonjour is a discovery protocol created by Apple, designed to make it easier to locate and connect to devices on our network. However, if you do not use Apple products, there will be no benefit to enabling this feature on your NAS. SSDP or Simple Service Discovery Protocol is a network protocol used mostly in home networks to advertise and discover network services supported by Universal Plug and Play. As you can see on our NAS, this setting is enabled by default, as it will help to allow Windows devices to access DiskStation Manager using a web browser. TFTP or Trivial File Transfer Protocol is a protocol mostly used by IT professionals and system administrators to transfer files, remotely boot devices without hard drives, or backup network and router configurations. Shared folder sync is a way that we can create a task that will schedule when rsync will synchronize a shared folder. However, as we do not intend to use rsync, we will be leaving this setting disabled. Finally, in File Services, we have Bypass Traversal Checking, which seems to be a function for Windows users that will allow them to bypass certain security checks. So, for example, if a user has access rights to a file, but not the folder that it's in, if that user has bypass traversal permissions, they will be able to access the file. So to summarize, in this video, we reviewed these settings in File Services. While we did not make any changes to the default settings, it is useful to know what these settings are for, particularly if in the future we need to troubleshoot or fix a problem once we've created our network shares. In the next video in this series, we're going to start to create network shares on our NAS by taking a look at the relationship between folders, users, permissions and groups.